Hey, everybody, we're back. Seems like forever, but it is time to wrap up the 70s on Matt and Cheryl's Gen Excellent playlist. I'm Matt.
I'm Sheryl.
We've been teasing this moment for several weeks. Our Elton John special. Elton John, the biggest selling musical artist of the decade of the 1970s. Obviously going to warrant his own special show from us since we have somehow avoided putting any of his songs on our playlist. That's not to say that we didn't like his song. I mean, we had several songs that were just like one or two away from making it onto the
in the early shows, we were only picking one or two songs each. We had to be very selective, I guess.
Yep, exactly. By the time we got to the point where we could start bringing in more of our personal favorites, it was kind of past his peak as a popular artist in the 1970s. But we're going to go through the whole decade here, the 1970s, for the man born Reginald Kenneth Dwight in Pinner, Middlesex, England, now known as Sir Elton Hercules John, one of the great recording artists of our lifetime, still going at it today. But his prime period as a recording artist, I think most would agree, was between 1970 and 1975.
Yeah.
We might go long with this episode, but I'm going to say probably less than 5% of it is going to be post-1975 Elton John material.
There's some interesting things that happened. Well, maybe like in 1976, but not much after that.
Yeah. We were just talking about that. We will talk about an album that's opened our eyes from 1976, but we'll begin at the beginning of the decade. Now, it wasn't his first record, but basically most people consider it his first. It was his first release in the United States, the self-titled album. Some people call it the Black Album, Elton John. First of all, just briefly, his biographical history. As I mentioned, born in Pinner, Middlesex, a suburban kid, middle-class English kid. Father was in the Royal Air Force, was a musician in the Royal Air Force, played the trumpet. Mother was musically oriented. I don't know about as a performer, but definitely a music fan and somebody who bought a lot of records, listened to a lot of different types of music. So he was in a musical household growing up. And it was discovered at an early age that he had this precocious talent for music. I think at the age of 4, his parents realized that he was just playing songs that he heard by ear on the piano. So within a couple of years, he was getting formal lessons. And at the age of 11, actually got a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music. And this is for artists bound for a career in classical music. So he got some classical schooling at the Royal Academy, but never really took to the whole classical culture. He certainly had the talent, but as he himself admits, physically, he wasn't made to be a classical pianist.
Yeah, he had short, stubby fingers.
Right. It cracks me up. In England especially, they really obsess about people's appearance. He's always described as chubby and tubby and stocky.
Yeah.
And I never think of Elton as being a fat guy. He's just a thick guy. He's short.
He's short and he's stocky.
He's built like a wrestler. He's got these Popeye thick arms and legs and fat stubby fingers. He's built like a tank, but not, most of your classical pianists are going to have long, bony fingers. And he just wasn't built that way, but obviously had a great talent for music.
And a great love for music.
Right. We've talked about this more than once, that some of our favorite artists are people who are like us, obsessive fans of music, very knowledgeable, obsessive collectors of music. Elton John certainly fits that category from a very young age. Music was very important, maybe the most important thing in his life, probably the most important thing in his life, but also a big sports fan as well. And that would factor in later on as well. So, he had his classical training. He didn't finish out school. He realized pop music was more of what he was going to be interested in. Eventually hooked up with a gigging band. They were called Bluesology. He was a teenager, so he's playing the keyboards in kind of a rootsy blues type band that was gigging around England. And they also backed up a lot of visiting artists from America, mainly black R&B soul artists. Major Lance, Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells. The one he cites as one of his favorites that they backed up, Billy Stewart. I don't know if a lot of people are familiar with Billy Stewart. He died in a car crash pretty young. He had a hit song. It was a cover of George Gershwin's Summertime. And he had this very over-the-top vocal style with all these like vocal sound effects and stuff. Elton John was a big fan and obviously built his chops, playing a wide variety of music, all kind of fed into the artist he would become. At a certain point, Long John Baldry hired the group to be his backing band. And Baldry was an interesting character, this really tall guy. He was a gay man and he was not in the closet. Although back then, if you were gay and the music press knew about it, they wouldn't write about it. I mean, that was nobody's business. So, I mean, I think a lot of people knew that a lot of artists were gay in the 60s and early 70s, but it just, it was kind of an unspoken agreement that it wouldn't be written about. And Baldry factors into one of Elton John's big hits in the 70s, which was on the Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy album, Someone Saved My Life Tonight, because Elton John was on the verge of marrying this gal, and John Baldry took him aside and said, dude, what are you doing? You're gay. Don't you really want to be marrying this woman? And Elton was just so innocent.
Yeah.
He was a sheltered child. He's mentioned that a lot in his autobiography and other biographies about him. He had a sheltered childhood. He was just very inexperienced sexually. And
he was a virgin until he was like 21.
Right, yeah. So,
and he was surrounded by some other people, too, that were very flamboyant, like Long John Baldry and Tony King. And they would make comments and things, and he just would never make the connection, that's what they were referring to, because it just wasn't even on his radar at all.
And even when he, quote unquote, came out in the 70s, I mean, he only kind of half-assed it. He said, I'm bisexual. He might have believed that at the time. He would actually marry a woman again later on in the 80s. But it took him a long time to come to terms with, the person he was. And thankfully, he's happily in a long-term relationship now with David Furnish. Anyhow, he wanted to be in the music business, but he was getting fed up with this bluesology thing, particularly after John Baldry had this easy listening huge hit, and they go from playing blues clubs to playing to older audiences and supper clubs, and he couldn't stand it, and having to play this song, at all these shows that didn't represent where his music interests lay. He finally broke with that and answered an ad in NME, New Musical Express, one of the two weekly papers, for Liberty Records, looking for potential artists. Audition there, didn't get the audition, but eventually they hired him on as a songwriter, and he got paired up with a guy named Bernie Taupin, who's this hick from the sticks in northern England, grew up very rurally in Lincolnshire. Young guy, a few years younger than Elton. Elton's still a teenager. I mean, Bernie's really went by the years. And they set out to be songwriters. They wanted to write songs and have other artists record them. Elton never really had any ambitions to be a performer. Well, for a while, they were cranking out these made-to-order songs, trying to write hits, formula type stuff, and it really wasn't them. And I want to take a little aside here. Tina Turner passed away before we came into this recording, and that got me to thinking too, her career renaissance in her mid-40s in the 1980s, having huge hits and MTV videos and everything, it reinforced this thing, especially for solo recording artists. I mean, it's one thing to have the talent, but to be a big success in the music business, you have to have a team behind you. So Tina Turner's not a composer. You got to have songs. Somebody's got to write those songs. Somebody's got to produce those songs. You got to have the right musicians to record those songs. You got to have the right management to get you in the right label situation. You got to have the right people promoting your music to get it out to the radio stations and MTV and all the outlets and get press reviews and articles. It takes a whole team to be a big star artist. So really everything eventually came together for Elton, and he seemed like an overnight success in the United States when he started having hits at the turn of the 70s. But he'd been plugging away for a few years, about a half dozen years before it started to come together for him. So he got some good advice. He had some people at the label that were supportive of him, could see the talent and see that maybe it was being misdirected. And basically they told Elton and Bernie, stop trying to write this commercial fluff, write what you feel, write what moves you.
And they really never had a hit with any other artists, like any songs that they were on staff for Dick James publishing. So they were writing and just nothing was clicking. And it's a really good example of how songwriting and songs really connect with people in a way, because you feel what the writer is feeling. It wasn't until they really just were speaking from their hearts, both musically and lyrically, that it started to click. And when it did, it really did.
Yes, yes. And what a unique partnership, too, this writing partnership between Elton John and Bernie Taupin. I'm not aware of any other examples like those two.
In the fact that they're not in the same room at the same time, writing partnerships, obviously, but they are collaborating. Right. This is like Bernie throws a paper down on the piano for Elton with lyrics, and then he writes the music, which is so weird. Nobody does that.
It's very unusual. Very unusual. Yeah. Not only, the complete separation of duties, but just the speed and the profligacy. I mean, just incredible. Once they started rolling in the 70s, they were cranking out so much music that the record buying public could not keep up.
Right.
Yeah.
It's pretty unprecedented, actually, like the amount of albums they had in such a short span of time. Yeah. And some of them double albums even. And the amount of quality music, that's hard to come by. It's just incredible how fast they wrote and recorded those albums.
So Elton records his first solo album in 1969. We're going to talk too much about that. It wasn't released in the United States until later, like the mid-'70s, after he was massively popular. It's called Empty Sky. And it didn't do anything. Didn't sell. Only a couple of songs really endured from that album. So that's out there. Doesn't really do much. And they record their next album, which is the self-titled album. And the first single release off that was Border Song. Now, my first exposure to Elton John was, and I'm sure many people's first exposure, was the Greatest Hits album that was released in 1974.
And probably one of the best and definitely one of the most popular Greatest Hits albums ever put out.
Certainly. It's up there. I mean, it's up there with the Eagles, Blue Greatest Hits album and just knockout songs start to finish. But Border Song was probably the most unfamiliar song on there because you never heard it on the radio. It wasn't a hit. I mean, it barely cracked the charts in the United States, but it was his first song that did get on the charts. And I think the reason that song made it on, whereas a couple of later songs that now are more familiar to people like Tiny Dancer or Leave On, basically nothing off Tumbleweed Connection or Madman Across the Water. Nothing off either of those albums made that great, which is amazing to me. But Border Song was covered by Aretha Franklin. So that was like the first wow moment for these guys. Like, oh my God, Aretha freaking Franklin is covering one of their songs. So, I mean, they're still nobodies at this point. They're absolute nobody. And Aretha Franklin's covering one of their songs. I mean, I can only imagine what that must have felt like. And Elton is such a huge fan of black music in particular. I mean, all types of music, but rhythm and blues and soul music. Huge fan. So that was obviously a huge feather in their caps. Even though Border Song wasn't a big hit, it was soulful, funky, a really cool song, and kind of an unusual song in their canon, too, because, we talked about the separation of duties. Bernie writes the lyrics. Elton is not in the room. He hands Elton a stack of papers. Elton grabs a piece of paper, starts looking at it, and then, noodles around the piano. Yeah, that'll work. Okay. Well, Elton actually wrote the final verse of Border Song. He added the final verse to that. And I didn't know that until we were researching this episode. And after listening to tons of Elton John, Bernie Taupin music over the decade, you could see where that last verse definitely did not come from Bernie's pen because it's got this peace and love vibe. There's my brother over there. What's his color? I don't care. Peace, my brothers. Let us live in peace. I mean, it fits the tenor of the times, but that is not Bernie's vibe at all. He's got this real dark side to him in his lyrics. And doesn't write a lot of political stuff. Doesn't write a lot of peace and love music.
He's not a hippy-dippy love child. Yeah.
No. So I like the verse. I mean, I think that song really holds up as a civil rights type anthem.
Yeah. But it was interesting to read that because it does make sense. You can feel that is a different sentiment that you don't normally hear in Bernie's lyrics.
Yeah.
And it's still one of my favorite songs of his, too. And it was featured in the movie. It was in Rocket Man. And Aretha's version is great. And it sounds like it was written for her, really.
Yeah. So Border Song, probably, it would have been the first song that a lot of people heard by Elton John, although not many people bought it. It barely cracked the top 100. So it spent 5 weeks on the American charts, reached 92, and got on the charts in August of 1970. His first real hit was Your Song. And for a lot of people, that is still the ultimate Elton John song. It's definitely the most played song. Of course, it's been around longer than most of them, but still a song that's played constantly on oldies radio today. So that was a bona fide hit in America. Now, in late 1970, his record label in England, you mentioned Dick James Music, DJM Records. Dick James published the Beatles music, so he was a big music business executive in England. His American record deal was with Uni Records, which didn't have a big roster. Neil Diamond was their other major artist. So here's where the team comes in and breaks Elton John as a star artist. It happened in America. Your Song's getting radio play. It's a top 40 hit. It's a top 10 hit in America. And Elton John, still at this point, their mindset is still, I'm not this performer, I'm not this star. We're basically putting out these albums, we're writing these songs in the hopes that other people are going to find them and want to record them. So he was a big Laura Nyro fan. Laura Nyro was a cult artist who a lot of other artists had hits with her material. She never had any hits. So he kind of thought of himself in those terms, I think. And she was a hot piano player too. Very influential on Elton John, as a matter of fact, and others. Todd Rundgren has cited Laura Nyro as a major influence. But Laura Nyro had a couple of albums out by this point. Eli and the 13th Confession, New York Tenderberry. So that's kind of what they're thinking here. We're putting out these albums, but we're thinking like Laura Nyro had, Blood, Sweat, and Tears had a hit. Fifth Dimension had a big hit with one of her songs. Barbra Streisand had a big hit with one of her songs. So that's what they're thinking is going to happen. We'll put out these albums. Other bigger names are going to discover these great songs, record them, and then we'll reap in the publishing money. Well, the American record company at Uni, the decision makers there, they heard the Elton John album and they were just completely, in Elton John's favorite term of the day, knocked out by it. And they said, we got to get him over here. We got to get him over to the States and play some dates. So they set up a club date at the Troubadour Club in LA, which was kind of a hip spot in Los Angeles. Primarily singer-songwriter, folk, rootsy type artists played there. That was like the big hangout in the 70s. The Eagles and Linda Ronstadt and that whole group would hang out around there before they were big hit artists. It was owned by a flamboyant, gay, tall guy named Randy Weston. So they set up this showcase date for Elton John in the summer of 1970 at the Troubadour. And here is where these record company guys just hit it out of the park. They got all these name artists to come and be in the audience. They got the interest of the press and some influential press in there. They got Neil Diamond in, their biggest artist on the label, to actually go up on stage and introduce Elton John at his first American concert at the Troubadour. It's a smallish club. So he's put out 2 albums at this point, and they're kind of orchestral, singer-songwriter, kind of somber, ballad-heavy albums. And now the singer-songwriter movement is really gaining steam, with Carole King and Joni Mitchell and James Taylor, all those. So people are expecting somebody in that vein. And here comes Elton with his new touring band. And you want to talk about having a team behind Elton John, his band.
Yes.
He is not the artist he became without these guys. No question about it. It's the rhythm section of Dee Murray on bass, Nigel Olsson on drums. So it's just a 3-piece. His first album, and actually his first 3 albums, or 4 albums if you count Empty Sky, were recorded with session musicians primarily. Dee and Nigel played on a couple of tracks on Madman and Tumbleweed Connection, the albums that would follow the self-titled album. But primarily it was recorded by session musicians. But this was his first touring band as a solo artist. And kudos to Elton or whoever managed to pick these guys, because what an amazing band he had. Amazing band. Great rhythm section. And later on, they would add David Johnston on guitar. But at this point, it's just a 3-piece, piano, bass, drum. And they're playing these songs off the Elton John record, which is very heavily orchestrated. I mean, it's got these heavy session musicians. It's got Paul Buckmaster's orchestral arrangements, Gus Dudgeon's elaborate productions, all these different classical instruments. And they're trying to replicate these songs live. But what a lot of people didn't realize about Elton is, at heart, he's a rock and roll guy. And they go out there at this Troubadour show and they just blow the roof off the place. And it says a lot about the man, because he put the work in. Now, he laughs off his early days, like his Royal Academies. He wasn't very studious. He wasn't a great student in school. He just didn't have the passion for it. But once things started to roll for him in pop music, he put the work in. And this guy who was a reluctant performer, never really wanted to be a performer, well, he would eventually become one of the all-time great live performers. And at this showcase gig in front of all these influential people in the center of the music business in the world, Los Angeles, California, he knew how important this gig was.
And it scared the crap out of him, too.
I think he threatened to go back home, didn't he?
Yeah. Leon Russell was in the audience, and, Neil Diamond, and people that he looked up to.
Yeah.
And here he is, just this kid, this naive kid.
Yeah.
It was just so overwhelming. And it really does kind of show, too, when it comes right down to it, this is a pretty insecure guy who is being thrust all of a sudden into this position that he wants, but it's scary, too. And he doesn't know if he can handle it. But then he gets out on the stage and he's a completely different person that is just so commanding and engaging, And
I think the only real misfire by the American record company, the Uni people, and Russ Regan is the guy's name. He was the head honcho. Of course, he had a team under him as well, promo people and the like. But the one misfire was they dolled up this London double-decker bus to go pick them up at the airport. And I think Elton is Elton is like thinking, it's Hollywood. Where's our limos?
Where's my limo?
Yeah, exactly. It's like we grew up riding the bus. We're trying to make it in the music business. You're putting us on a freaking London bus. We're in America.
How is this glamorous?
Never been to America before. This is what picks us up at the airport. So that was kind of a misfire. And I think that pissed him off. And, he got a little petulant about him. And a couple other things led to him like threatening to go back home. But other than that, those guys deserve a lot of credit. It's not like Uni was some big heavy-hitting label, but they sure nailed it with Elton John. So Elton nails his big moment. Robert Hilburn, still fairly new writer for the LA Times, writes this glowing review, and Elton's career is off like a shot in the United States. So Your Song's a big hit. He gets rave notices, and then everybody starts to pay attention. And then the snowball starts rolling. But there would be a little hiccup down the road. And it had to do with just how prolific Elton and Bernie were and how hardworking these guys were. They just cranked out so much music in a short period of time. So the self-titled album, Your Song, the big hit everybody knows, Border Song, the hit that wasn't, but was his first release in America. And then you mentioned Take Me to the Pilot. I think that got some airplay on FM radio back then, and it endured for a while. That's showing his rootsy gospel influence. You mentioned Leon Russell. At that time, Leon Russell was like his biggest idol and probably his biggest influence. And that gospel, rootsy, southern, funky American music really turned Elton on. And Bernie Taupin as well. So they were both huge fans of the band, of Leon Russell. Of course, Leon Russell was the one who orchestrated Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour, which was this massive touring rock show, very successful at the end of the 1960s. Of course, Delaney and Bonnie fits into that as well, their music, which used some of the same musicians that Joe Cocker did with the Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour, the musicians that would go on to record with Eric Clapton as Derek and the Dominoes. So a lot of that fed into Elton John's sound. More of that sound would come out with his next album, but Take Me to the Pilot, definitely in that vein. You've got a lot of heavily orchestrated stuff on here. I love No Shoestrings on Louise because Elton's a huge Rolling Stones fan. And it's like he purposely put a Stones tribute on his early albums. And this is in the vein of the Stones kind of country parody.
Country stuff.
Type songs like Sweet Virginia and Dead Flowers and stuff like that. I like it. And he's definitely aping Mick Jagger in his vocal style on that. And then you got the side closer on side one and the side opener on side two, the most heavily orchestrated songs, or two of the most heavily orchestrated songs in the album. First episode at Hyenton.
That one really has a Leonard Cohen influence to me.
And that was their thinking. It's like they were thinking along Leonard Cohen lines at this point.
Like that's the kind of artist he would be.
Yeah, another guy who had other people cover a lot of his songs. I really like 60 Years On quite a bit. And the string intro is a polarizing thing, the Buckmaster strings. I love it because it's clearly influenced, the classical composer Ligeti, but it would have come via the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was obviously still resonating at this point in 1970. That soundtrack, those dissonant strings, definitely a nod to that. I like it a lot. It was kind of tacked on to the front of the song. Really wasn't part of the conception of the song originally, but I like it as an intro. It draws your attention in. And then 60 Years On is kind of foreshadowing the Americana bent they would take very heavily on their next album, Tumbleweed Connection, with the story of like an old cowboy or old soldier. Then you got Border Song, again, that gospel influence, very heavy on there. The Greatest Discovery, which it's kind of a sweet song about a young child with a new baby sibling coming into the family. I think Bernie wrote it from the perspective of his older brother, welcoming him into the family. The Cage is one of the few rockers on the song. I like it a lot. I really like it.
Yeah. But you're right, it is one of the few rockers because there's so much orchestrated stuff on this album.
Ow, ow,
yeah.
Ow, ow, yeah, no, it's a great song. The King Must Die, I don't love. I
think the drums are cool, and it's very dramatic. Now, have you heard Three Dog Night's version of Your Song?
No.
They actually released it on their album before this came out. I guess he was an opening act for them. They didn't release it as a single because Elton John was a new artist and they wanted him to release it himself. Honestly, Your Song has never been one of my favorites of his, but when I listened to the Three Dog Night version, I was like, oh, actually, I do really like this song. It makes me like Elton's a lot more.
It's so hard to judge that song just because you've heard it so many times.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
So many times. That just gets played to death still.
It does, and there's honestly only a few of his songs that are in that category for me where I just am like, ugh, this song again. There's not that many. I can think of 3 right now. And other than that, even though they're songs I've heard so many times, I'm not tired of them, oddly, the rest of them.
I love all 3 bonus tracks on the self-titled album. You've got Bad Side of the Moon, which if you've heard his live album, his first live album, that's the first track on it. And they kind of changed the arrangement. So they start off with that Uzamala, Uzamala, Uzamala. That's how they bring the song in. I think it's pretty cool. And then Gray Seal, which is a lot of people's, as far as deep cuts go, Gray Seal would be the top, near the top of the list for a lot of people. But I think a lot of people don't realize that they know it from Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, but it was a single B-side in England in 1970 first in a different version. And I really like both versions. I'm not sure which I like better. I think I like the re-recorded version better. It's just the jam on that at the end. It's just so exquisite. You know, it's just so great.
I'll have to listen to that. I haven't listened to that version.
So the A-side was a song called Rock and Roll Madonna. So 4 years before Benny and the Jets came out, they did something similar where they dubbed in crowd sounds to make it sound live on this. And it's a pretty basic Stones boogie rocker, but it's fun. It's good. So that was a standalone single in England. Rock and Roll Madonna with Gray Seal on the B-side wasn't a hit, but all really good B-sides, worthy B-sides on that first record. So Elton's cracked America. He's got his name out there. And then comes this avalanche of material. Even as he's doing this Troubadour gig, his first gig in America, people are only just starting to become familiar with Elton John on the radio with Your Song, which really wouldn't peak until the new year, 1971. It was released in 70. They've basically got their next album in the can already, and they're already performing songs from Tumbleweed Connection. I think this is his greatest album, and Sheryl, I think you're of the same mindset.
Yes, and this is the album that I've known the longest spent the most time with. I think every song is great. I think as a whole, it's a great album to listen to all the way through.
Yes. No singles on it.
No, I have Elton John kind of separated in 2 camps in my mind. I have Tumbleweed Connection and Madman Across the Water, those 2, and then everything else. Because particularly Tumbleweed Connection, there's no singles. So many people think of Elton as a singles act because he did have, an amazing run of singles.
Yeah, I'm guilty as charged. And that's what kept me from really getting to know his albums until pretty late in life. I just always perceived of him as a singles act. But Elton himself said from the beginning, no, that was never his mindset. He was always an albums act. Yeah.
And this is also where you really get the band influence, and
very much so.
I mean, it does seem like it was influenced by like Americana, although they had never seen America firsthand when they wrote this album. So it's really taken more from just the music that they were listening to.
They were not shy about sharing their influence from the band, even from the album art, that sepia tone. The band, of course, the band's second record, a lot of people call it the Brown album. Definitely a nod to that with the color scheme. I love the fact on the album cover, you've got that train station. It looks like an Old West train station. It's actually in suburban London. And apparently it looked much the same many years later, too. But Bernie Taupin had never been to America. Elton had never been to America. But Bernie had this deep fascination with Americana, Westerns, gangsters, all this iconography of America, American movies, comic books, the whole bit. And this is him writing from that perspective. And the sound of this record is so great. The performances are wonderful, phenomenal songs. And I feel like it peaks in the middle with the end of side 1, beginning of side 2. So you got My Father's Gun, the last song on side 1, Where To Now St. Peter, opening side 2. I love how the album just kind of builds to that apex in the middle. I'm not going to say it drops off because you got Amarina on side 2, which is just a wonderful, beautiful, sexy song.
And that's the first song that Dee Murray and Nigel Olsson appeared together as the rhythm section.
Yes.
And they used that song in the movie too. So people might be familiar with the song from the Rocket Man movie.
And they used that song in another movie, Dog Day Afternoon, over the opening credits. Really? Amarina. Yeah. Pretty interesting.
One song on this album that did get radio airplay, but not as a single, was Burn Down the Mission.
Right. Big production album closer. Heavy gospel influence again. And Elton, I think, cites Laura Nyro here particularly the opening piano bit on this song. And it was a big concert number for them in their early days.
Yeah.
Kind of a rave up. But just a wonderful vibe to this album, start to finish. I even like Love Song, which is a real oddity because it's not written by Elton and Bernie. Well, Elton wrote the music, I guess, but it was written by a gal named Leslie Duncan, who was a backing vocalist on some of these early numbers. The lyrics are totally hippy-dippy.
Obviously not Bernie's.
It's a beautiful song, and it's got lovely harmonies on it. It clearly doesn't sound like anything that Elton and Bernie wrote. It's a real departure. But I think it fits on the album really nicely. But like you, this has been the album that has been most familiar to me and really the first Elton John album that I got into. Of course, I'd known his singles forever since I can remember.
His greatest hits was one of the first CDs I ever bought, you know? Yeah.
Well, and then, I've talked many, many times on our early episodes about those radio show records I had. And all of his hit singles were on those. So I knew his music from a very young age.
It wouldn't be the 70s without those songs. I mean, they're so huge.
Yeah. They're already performing songs from this, and this album's ready to come out at the end of 1970. They had to kind of delay the release of it because he's starting to break in America, and Your Song's still riding on the charts, and the first album's selling. So this was released in England at the end of 70, but not until January 71 in America. And it sold well, even though there were no singles on it. Now you got this deluge coming. So he did this soundtrack album to a movie called Friends. I actually do have a vinyl copy of this hideous album cover.
And is it a cutout?
Yes, it is.
It is.
Of course it is. It's a running joke that Elton makes that nobody's ever seen a copy of this record without a punch hole in it.
Yeah.
I didn't listen to any of this stuff until today. There's some good stuff on here. It really is. Can I Put You On? And Friends, the title track, was actually a charting hit in 1971. They're just cranking out so much music. And I think it perturbed Elton because this was his first experience writing for a movie. So he's having to compose to pictures and make to order. Well, they didn't have enough music to really make a full record. So I guess it was Paramount Records to put this out. They needed more material. So Elton and Bernie had to give up a couple of songs. I think they were hoping to put on their next actual album. And Can I Put You On is one of those. It's got a great jam at the end of it. I don't know if you even listened to this before.
I forgot to listen to it. I haven't listened to it still. And the movie was a huge flop too.
Just a
horrible movie. So that's even more frustrating for them, to have to waste these songs on this awful movie.
So that comes out in 71. And then you get the live album, which was recorded in a radio studio. In England, it's 17/11/70. In America, it's 11/17/70 because we do the dates differently. You and I both read these Rolling Stone record guides and stuff as we were getting into music, and Elton never got a lot of love from the critics, particularly in retrospect when those guides came out in the 80s. And this got like a 1-star review or something. Well, these guys it's just a killer live album. These guys are so great on stage.
Well, they've definitely changed their tune in the recent All Music Guide. Yeah. Every album is not every album, but we'll talk about that. But a lot of them are 5-star albums. Yeah.
But don't overlook this live album because it's the first live record for Elton John, and it's the 3-piece. It's before Davy Johnston is in the band. And the racket that they can kick up without a guitar, just piano, bass, and drums is pretty phenomenal. I don't think Elton's in his best voice on this record. He was a good vocalist from the beginning, but he became a great vocalist. I mean, he matured really quickly. And by the time the next record comes out, which we're going to talk about now, Mad Man Across the Water, now he's gone to a different level as a vocalist. Side 1 of this record is just fabulous. Just fantastic. The last song to resonate for me was Razorface, but I love that now too. But it starts with Tiny Dancer. We should do a list sometime. We've already talked about it more than once. Songs that most people assume were big hits but weren't. Tiny Dancer is a great example. I mean, that's one of his most iconic songs now because of its use in Almost Famous.
And it's a radio staple and has been, FM radio staple.
And it was a single release, but it was not a hit. It did not make the top 40.
It's a long song.
Yeah.
It's over 6 minutes long, but there wasn't an edited version.
I think there was a promo 45 edited version.
That's not what you hear on the radio now. I mean, not as the single, maybe when they originally played it as a single.
But so the album, it opens with Tiny Dancer and then Leave On, which I've really come to appreciate. I mean, I knew this song before. During the preparation for this episode, I've listened to Madman Across the Water, I think more than any other album. I've listened to it a lot. And his singing on Leave On is so great. So great.
Yeah.
I think that's his first great vocal performance on record.
It's one of the more emotive vocal performances for him.
Yeah. Toward the end of the song, when it's really building up.
Yeah.
He gets into
the last verse.
He does the whoo. I mean, he's so into it. I mean, he is so committed. And I love his singing on Razorface. Again, the team, okay? Nigel and Dee, Gus Dudgeon, Paul Buckmaster. Yep. I mean, all of this feeds into the greatness that is Elton John. Gus Dudgeon is a fantastic producer. And I love what they do on Razorface with his harmonies. Now, Dee and Nigel were great backing vocalists, and Davy Johnston as well took it to another level. But the harmonies on Razorface, it's Elton harmonizing with himself. And I love how he double tracks Elton's voice. So like during a line, it's double track where both voices are singing the same thing, and then it veers into a harmony part. It's just so beautifully done. Now, the lyrics on Leave On, Bernie's an interesting cat, isn't he? I mean, a lot of his songs he claims were influenced by his upbringing in Lincolnshire, his rural upbringing, and people he knew and experiences he had. But a lot of his songs, and Leave On is one that he has owned up to. It's not based on anything.
Right.
He just started writing words, and that's what came out.
And it is pretty random, you know. There are some things in there that are odd.
But it's so evocative, and it's just such a great mood. And
he names his kid Jesus, and you know.
And Jesus, he wants to go to Venus.
Yeah.
I love it. I mean, it paints pictures of your mind. Jesus picking off one of the balloons and sailing away, leaving Leave On behind. It's basically about a kid not wanting to follow in his father's footsteps. Essentially, you know, that's what it comes down to.
It is one of those songs that really does create like a visual image in your mind.
It's just such a great production, beautifully sung by Elton. And then the last track, Madman Across the Water, probably his heaviest, his heaviest song to this point, even though
I think it's one of the best songs of the 70s.
It's great. It's fantastic.
And it was actually recorded originally for Tumbleweed Connection with Mick Ronson on guitar. That version is on as a bonus track on Tumbleweed Connection. Not as good.
Yeah.
It just doesn't have the power behind it and the same feel to it. It makes sense because it does seem like a song that could fit on Tumbleweed too.
Yeah. But again, Paul Buckmaster's arrangements here, Gus Dudgeon's production.
Just so dramatic. And I just think it's such a great song.
Side 1 is 5 stars, exclamation point.
Yes.
Side 2, not so much.
I know. And I realized that when I would listen to this album, I had it on vinyl. So I would listen to side 1. When I was listening to all the albums this time, I was like, I don't really know side 2 hardly at all. It really didn't grab me as good.
No, it just doesn't hold the attention. It just doesn't grab and hold the attention. Now, Indian Sunset is this big epic song, pretty ham-fisted lyrics in retrospect. And a lot of Bernie's lyrics from this era don't really hold up to modern scrutiny very well.
Yeah.
Let's just put it that way. You don't want to go down the Bernie Taupin early 70s lyric book with a fine-tooth comb. There's a lot of songs that would put people off now. There is one song on side 2 that I would definitely revisit over and over down the years, and that's Holiday Inn. I love that song.
Yes. Yeah. With the sitar, mandolin,
beautiful
and
production.
The strings. Yeah. That I do really like that song too.
Kind of a corny lyric, but it's tongue in cheek. It's not meant to be serious. I mean, he's definitely being ironic. They don't think the Holiday Inn is like this Nirvana paradise. They're basically think it's a shithole.
Right.
But we're stuck here in another Holiday Inn in another city, and on and on and on it goes. Holiday Inn is easily, for me, the highlight on side 2. Rotten Peach is starting to grow on me a little, but I don't think it's nearly as good as anything on side 1 of the record. It just kind of tapers off. All the nasties, he's already writing a response to the press. Nobody wants to hear that. It just kind of tails off at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I've definitely discovered in going and listening to all these albums, every one of his albums has 1 or 2 absolute gem album tracks. And on this album, definitely Holiday Inn on side 2. And I'm talking about tracks that you don't hear on the radio. I mean, with the exception of Razorface, everything on side 1 got played on the radio. Madman Across the Water, Tiny Dancer, and Leave On.
Leave On hit number 24.
That's the most surprising omission from the greatest hits album.
Mm-hmm.
That they chose to put Border Song on instead of Levon, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that's true.
Levon was a much bigger hit and a great song. A really great song. Yeah.
Yeah. And not necessarily named after Levon Helm from the band.
Yeah, but I mean, clearly they were enthralled in the band, no question about it. And there is a funny story about that. I mean, Levon, I think, thought the song was supposed to be about him.
Yeah.
So he's listening to this song about calls his child Jesus, sells cartoon balloons in town, and Levon Helm's like, the hell's he talking about?
This British guy.
Somebody had to explain to Levon, no, it's not about you. They love you, so they wanted to call it. And I don't even know if that's true. I've read some accounts where they called it Levon, but I think Bernie Taupin has said no, it had nothing to do with it. Yeah. Even though they both loved the band. I mean, loved the band. So, all right. So Madman Across the Water, still great stuff, but doesn't hold a candle to Tumbleweed Connection for me. And this is also the end of an era here with Madman Across the Water. This is also where the onslaught of product kind of worked against Elton John. So there was a bit of a backlash at this point. Madman Across the Water didn't sell all that well. It was considered kind of a flop. And also, they made a change with the next record in that he started recording with his touring band instead of session musicians. I think he wanted to do it sooner, but Gus Dudgeon didn't feel comfortable. He wanted to work with these more seasoned pros than these young unknown guys. And I think really the only experience that Nigel and Dee had was they were in Spencer Davis Group before Elton John brought them on board. And this is Spencer Davis Group long after Steve Winwood had left the band. I don't know. Maybe they're having hits in England still. I don't know. Certainly not anything impactful in America. Elton gets his wish. And with the next album, it's recorded with his touring band, Dee Murray on the bass, Nigel Olsson on the drums, and a guy named Davey Johnston on guitar. And bringing him into the fold in his touring, a lot of people were like, well, what do you want to do that for? This guy's like a folk musician. He's
an acoustic guitarist. Yeah. He'd never played electric guitar. Never.
Acoustic guitar, mandolin. Now, he's a nice player.
Yeah.
Boy, did these people get surprised later on when they heard what he could do with an electric. Because he certainly fit the bill. And if you were to put a picture next to an encyclopedia entry or a dictionary entry about 70s rock star, you could put Davey Johnston's face on there. I mean, he's like the paradigm of an early 70s, mid 70s rock star, the way he looked with that long blonde hair, kind of the bangs. And, just a great look. All those guys.
He still looks like that now, in current day.
Yeah. So the Honky Chateau album is next. And this is, again, kicking it up to another level. So he's had a couple of hits at this point. Your Song was a pretty sizable hit in America. It wasn't a number one or anything. No singles off Tumbleweed Connection. A couple of minor hits with Levon off Madman and Friends off the Friends soundtrack that made the top 40. So Honky Chateau comes out, and two big hit singles on this record. The first track, Honky Cat, and Rocket Man, which closes side one. Here's another thing I've been thinking about. First of all, I don't think Elton John has any 5-star album. He has some really good albums, but there's always, a track or two that don't quite make it for me.
Yeah, even Tumbleweed, I think, falls under that. But that's
Tumbleweed's like a 4. That's like a 4.5.
Right. He has a few I would consider 4.5s, but yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of his albums could be sequenced better, I think. I don't know, Honky Chateau opens with Honky, and I love this song. I mean, again,
me too.
So this is his touring band playing now, and Nigel Olsson. So not only are Elton and Bernie enthralled with the band, Nigel Olsson's also heavily influenced by Levon Helm's drumming style. He's got that loose, funky, light touch, very syncopated. He's a tighter drummer than Levon. He's a little tighter than Levon. What made Levon so special is he's very loose, but just such an amazing feel to his drumming. And Nigel's very much in his style. And the drumming on Honky Cat is just superlative. And then Elton's got that New Orleans funky piano thing going. This whole album is a rhythm juggernaut. It's all about rhythm. And now you're seeing the influence not only of the band, but I think like Little Feat and that New Orleans sound. That's starting to seep in now too. So honestly, though, I don't know about Honky Cat as the opener. I might have opened this with Rocket Man, but Rocket Man is kind of different from the rest of the record. It doesn't have that funky,
yeah, Honky Cat
feel.
Is a better example of the feel of the album. In fact, it's weird because I forget that Rocket Man is on this album.
It doesn't really fit in the album, does it?
Yeah, it seems out of place.
But what it does introduce, and I'm not going to say Rocket Man is my favorite Elton John song, but I think it's his greatest single.
I think it's
so
his
too.
Greatest single. I think it's one of the best songs of the 70s.
Yeah. Oh,
period.
Absolutely. What it introduces here. So not only is this backing band great musicians, great on their instruments, but the backing vocals and the harmonies on his songs are just out of this world. And this is really where it gets introduced, is on Rocket Man, on the chorus. It's just celestial.
And that might be why it feels so different on this album, too.
So I might start the album with Rocket Man rather than Honky Cat, but it's a great record. It's one of his best. And one of his absolute best deep cuts, too. Mellow, the second track.
Yeah.
And of all the songs that are influenced by the band, I think this is the most overt. I love the touch on the solo. It's Jean-Luc Ponty on the electric violin. And I listened to this a few times. I'm like, wow, it sounds like Garth Hudson's organ, but I don't think it's an organ. It sounds like it might be a guitar that they're trying to make it sound like Garth Hudson's organ. It's Jean-Luc Ponty, the violinist who played with Zappa. He's a fusion guy.
Yeah.
And they're running his violin through a Leslie speaker. And that's how they got that sound. But the actual solo itself definitely caught from Garth Hudson. Clearly a nod to him. It's such a great song. Such a great song. I just love it so. And I didn't know this song at all until we started getting ready for this episode.
Right. You hadn't heard this album.
Now you start to see the dark humor of Bernie Taupin in the next song. I think I'm going to
kill myself.
This jaunty little song about teenage suicide.
Jaunty. And it's funny too, because it's well known that Elton has made a few attempts to kill himself. And this song really does soundtrack what those attempts were like. They were either done in a way that were obviously not going to be successful.
Yeah.
Or everyone around him knew what he was doing, and he declared, I'm going to kill myself. I just swallowed a bunch of pills. And,
like the big swimming pool scene in the movie.
Yes.
Still, it's a very entertaining song. Then you got Susie Dramas, which is a harder funk song. It's got some cool guitar on it.
And it sounds like it could have been on Tumbleweed, actually.
Yeah,
it has sort of that same feel to
they're still continuing with that Americana vibe on this album. Salvation, very strong gospel feel on that. Slave, again, here's a Bernie Taupin lyric. So many of his songs, you'd say, can't write that today.
Yeah, that wouldn't fly.
Nope. Can't do that one today. So here's again, sequencing. How does Mona Lisa's and Mad Hatters not close this album? That's a misstep.
Yeah.
What a great song.
It would be like Burn Down the Mission closing Tumbleweed. It seems like it makes sense. And that is a song that you do hear on the radio. It's
beautiful ballad.
Gorgeous song.
Paying to New York. Yeah, Hockey Chateau. So this is, now he's becoming a hit machine with this record. Rocket Man and Honky Cat, both big hits. And for the next few years, he can do no wrong as far as the charts are concerned. This is basically, it's his comeback. So I think he's starting to get written off, with the onslaught, the little backlash on Mad Men Across the Water. This was almost like a comeback album for him. It's a totally different vibe. It sounds so different from Mad Men. Complete departure, but it still sounds very much like Elton.
I think it sounds more like Tumbleweed than Mad Men, but Rocket Man is just such a massive song.
It's just an incredible production. Again, Gus Dudgeon here. And the interesting tie here, the theme of this song, very similar to Bowie's Space Oddity, which was produced by Gus Dudgeon. And that's how he got the Elton job, because when they were seeking out record producers for that first record, their first choice was George Martin. And they couldn't get him. They loved Bowie's Space Oddity. And I think they'd already hooked up with Paul Buckmaster first, right? And I think Paul Buckmaster said, well, if you like that Bowie song so much, they brought him in because he did the string arrangements on it. Why not ask Gus Dudgeon to produce the record? That turned out to be a pretty good choice.
Yeah. And actually, Hercules, which is the last song on that album, which is also Elton's middle name that he gave himself and what he calls his mansion, that song sounds a lot like David Bowie.
And again, getting back to Elton John, the music lover, he's listening to everything. He's clued into everything musical. And he's taken influences from wherever. And he's got great taste.
Yeah, this is about the era where I saw some YouTube videos of him shopping around in Tower Records on Sunset Boulevard. He's got a binder of pages of things that he's buying, and he's marking off on his binder, and he's grabbing things, and he's got a box full of records at the end. And he's very studiously going through this list, and he knows exactly what he's looking for. And I think that was a very common shopping trip for him.
So this record's also kind of his transition from FM albums artist to AM hitmaker. So two big hits, the two big hits on here, Honky Cat and Rocket Man. Now, prior to this, he'd had some hits, but really album-length statements. They have the orchestrated, self-titled album, Tumbleweed Connection, no singles. Just, take the album as a whole. Mad Mad Across the Water, definitely an album statement. Now he's morphing into more of an AM guy, a singles artist, and that really comes to the fore on his next record, which is Don't Shoot Me, I'm the Piano Player. Now he gets his first American #1 hit with Crocodile Rock. Two big hits on this. It leads off with Daniel. I like this song more than you do. I've always liked it.
It's just a little bit too soft rock for me. I've never disliked it. And when I've listened to it in the past, just like on the greatest hits or heard it on the radio, it never bothered me. But when I listened to it on the album, for some reason, I was like, wow, this is like just a little bit too soft and precious.
Yeah, the production is not as good on this album. And I think it speaks volumes that, there's Mobile Fidelity Sound Labs, which did the original master recordings, the audiophile, the vinyl and CD recordings. They did Madman, they did Tumbleweed, they did Honky Chateau, they did Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, but they skipped this one. It just doesn't sound as good as those other records. It's a thinner sound, and they're going for more of a pop sound here. And the inspiration of this album is it's kind of a nostalgic feel, and this is when nostalgia was hot. I mean, this is American Graffiti. Happy Days came out soon after this. So
yeah, that's true.
People were starting to look back to the 50s and 60s, a more innocent time. And I think Elton and Bernie were kind of going for that vibe on this record, certainly with Crocodile Rock. That is their tribute to pre-Beatles, fluffy pop hits of the 60s, late 50s. Daniel's a really good song. There's really nothing on here that I think High Flying Bird is the best deep track in the album closer, one of his better album closers. It's a really beautiful ballad, but compared to the sophistication of the stuff he'd released to that point, pretty simple melody, nothing too complicated.
This is probably the only album that I really didn't want to go back and listen to again.
Yeah.
It sounds rushed, and it's just mostly forgettable.
Yeah, I agree. I think the sound quality has a lot to do that. Now, I've only really listened to the early CD, the Japan for US first CD edition. And there may be better masterings out there that have a fuller sound that I need to check out.
It felt thin to me too, and I was just listening to whatever version is on
There's
Spotify.
Nothing bad on here. I mean, there's no bad tracks. Teacher, I Need You.
The whole thing is fine. It's just fine.
Elderberry Wine is kind of a sticky, it kind of sticks in your mind. It's
a pretty good rocker, but it's pretty ordinary.
I think
that's where I think a lot of this album just feels ordinary to me.
I like I'm Going to Be a Teenage Idol. I think that's a tribute to Mark Bolan. I mean, he's starting to rub elbows with all the big star recording artists of the day. Texas Love Song is interesting. I think it's a misfire. I don't hate it. I read a description. I think it was perfect. It's like they're channeling Merle Haggard via Randy Newman. So it's kind of got that Okie from Muskogee vibe where they're making fun of conservative rednecks, but it's not particularly well executed. Crocodile Rock, a lot of people scoff at that. A lot of Elton John fans are like, I don't care if I ever, it was his first #1 hit in the USA. It's a fun little track. It's definitely not one of his greatest. I do think the synthesizer, I think there's a synthesizer and a Farfisa organ on it, not just a organ. I'll have to listen closer. And it's interesting that the two singles don't really feature piano. So you got
that's true.
Daniel's got the Rhodes piano with the Mellotron, and then Crocodile Rock is more of the organ, which is atypical of a lot of his music. But really the only revelation on this album, I think, was High Flying Bird, which, again, every one of his albums has got at least one deep track that is worthy of a playlist. Now you get to his magnum opus, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I think he called Honky Chateau their Revolver and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road their White Album. It's a great album, but it's not, it's a double. So like a lot of double albums, it's padded out a bit.
It's just barely worthy of being a double album. Like, it's so close. It's so close.
But it starts like a house of fire. I mean, disc 1, side 1, that's one of the great rock album sides. And this was his big rock statement. So he's kind of pivoting from an FM albums artist to an AM hitmaker. But track 1 on this is his big rock statement. And it's deservedly up there. 73 was a big year for these, like Quadrophenia, Dark Side of the Moon, all these big, and Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding is an FM radio staple to this day, and certainly is worthy of being in the mix with those great rock records from that year.
Yeah, and this song is really his first kind of stepping into the sort of prog category.
Yeah, certainly the first track, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that song. I just mean that song. Yeah.
And
really,
funny.
This whole album is much more FM rock oriented. And it's varied, but it does feel more like you said, it fits into the era of rock and FM rock radio more than any of his other albums. And it's kind of funny too, because I feel like if you look at the track list, maybe 8 of the songs, whether or not they were singles, became songs that you heard on FM radio, which is quite a few. But I always kind of just took those songs independently. I really hadn't spent a lot of time just listening to this album all the way through. This is probably one that I was most surprised by, that I actually wanted to go back and listen to more and listen to it as an album statement all the way through. It has a much different feel to it. I mean, everything up until this really has been so much more in that Americana, like the band vein. And you don't get any of that in this album.
Not really. I've been so busy with baseball season. I haven't given this album the time it deserves. And it's honestly embarrassing to me that I haven't really
listened to it more.
No, I haven't. I mean, I've loved Elton John since I was a little kid, but I just never got into his albums. The perception was, he's the greatest, great singles artist.
Yeah.
Got to have his greatest hits. Maybe if you're going to have an Elton John album, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, that's considered his great work. But I had Tumbleweed Connection to discover what a great album that was. But did I follow up? I think the only other album I had in my collection until recently was Madman. And I never listened to that. I didn't really care for it. It was kind of buried in my collection until, revisiting it recently.
Yeah, I feel the same way about this album because I really never owned this album. I knew a lot of the songs on it. I knew them because I'd heard them on the radio, but I really had never owned this album or listened to it all the way through. But actually, surprisingly, it's become one of my favorites of his.
Yeah, well, there's so much great stuff here. But side 1, disc 1, Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding. It's hard to imagine. So Elton's a big star now. He's had hit singles. He's had a number 1 with Crocodile Rock. He'd have 4 more before the decade's out. So if you were an Elton John fan and been following him for a few years, you put this album on and Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding is the first track. It's 5 minutes before his voice even comes in.
Yeah.
That had to have been like, what is going on here? What is this?
Is this a Ken Russell film soundtrack?
Yeah.
Like Tommy, it has kind of that feel to it,
but
very bombastic and in a much different style. And you're right, just a long intro, instrumental.
Here's where
intro.
His band really, in the live setting, what they did with this. I mean, it's such a great rockin' band that he had behind him, the Elton John band. Now, the revelatory part of the listening for me on this was Candle in the Wind, because this has been a song that's been very heavily exposed. Again, another song that a lot of people assume was a big hit that wasn't even released as a single in the United States when this album came out.
Because it was a big hit later.
Yes.
When it was re-released, but not originally.
2 re-release versions, the live in Australia and then after Princess Diana died. So this version, when I put this on, I'm Candle in the Wind. Here we go. But I know I'd heard this. Obviously, I'd heard this before. It's been a long time. But the album version, the original album version, this song is just so great. And the harmonies are so beautiful on this. It's just an exquisite song.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because it has become a song that no one ever wants to hear ever again, because it's just been so overplayed.
Yeah.
But right, I did the same thing. I actually was like, this is a really good song.
Oh,
surprisingly,
so
this is a really good song and it sounds great and the harmonies are great. I was pleasantly surprised by that too.
So you get this rock opus to open the album. this fanfare, this musical fanfare that goes on 5 minutes plus before Elton's vocals come in, and it rocks the hell out of your first 10 minutes of the album. And then this just gorgeous ballad comes on, beautifully melodic, amazing harmonies. Then the album side closes with what may be my favorite Elton John song. And this is a song that's a lot of people don't like, is Benny and the Jets. I love it.
I love it.
I've loved it ever since I was a little kid. I've loved it from the first time I've heard it. And again, brilliant production decision here to add the effects and the live feel to this. It just takes it out of this world, because if you don't have that live feel, I don't know how they managed to do it so well. It sounds like you're in this arena and he's playing live.
I always thought it was.
Without all those effects, it's not really that great of a song. But you add all that to it, and it's incredible. The end of it with the piano and the synth, what he's doing with those, and that raspy synth sound.
Yeah.
The way the piano and the drums play off each other, it is so cool. And this was another feather in Elton John's cap. They never thought Benny and the Jets, it was like the last song they thought would be a single. They wanted Candle in the Wind to be released worldwide, but in the United States, they came to discover that this black radio station in Detroit was playing the hell out of Benny and the Jets and getting a great response. And the record company's like, I think his name was Pat Pipolo, said, you got to release this as a single. I'm telling you, I may be dead wrong here, but I think if you put this out, you're going to have a hit on black radio and AM radio, pop radio and rock radio. And that turned out to be true. He had a number one hit, his second number one. It got played on black radio. It charted high in the R&B charts. And he got invited to play on Soul Train. I think he was the first. It was either Elton or David Bowie, the first white artist ever to perform on Soul Train, which had to have been incredibly gratifying for somebody with a deep love, knowledge, and appreciation of black music.
Yes. There was a live version of this with Cher from her show. It's really good, actually. But the thing that's interesting about it is that Cher and he trade off verses. You can actually understand the lyrics because she enunciates.
She does enunciate. She does do that.
And she sings it in a way that is like, oh, that's what they're saying. Like, because it's one of those songs that is so muddled that you really don't know exactly what he's saying.
If I had to guess, I've listened to this song probably 2,000 times at least in my life, and I couldn't tell you a lot of the lyrics. I think at one point I must have looked them up, but I've forgotten. And a lot of Elton songs, the lyrics are hard to make out, like Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, this title track.
Yes.
That's kind of hard to make out those. But then some song like Daniel. Let's go back to Daniel. Those lyrics are very upfront and very easy to hear.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that song is so poignant, again, it's vague, it's open to interpretation, but I think because of the timing of when that song came out, a lot of people felt like it was about the Vietnam War and about a younger brother and an older brother who'd been to the war and come back and was changed. And it was a really poignant song for a lot of people because of that. And it's good that the lyrics are upfront and interpreted. Tom Petty said something I heard years and years and years ago when I was young, maybe even back as early as when Damn the Torpedoes was on the charts. He said that he purposefully wanted his vocals mixed down and be hard to hear the lyrics because people listen closer if they can't understand the lyrics really clearly. Then they tune in, they're listening a lot closer, trying to make out what you're saying, which I always thought was interesting. You know? So I don't know if that was part of the strategy here, but a lot of Elton songs are like that, where the lyrics are kind of hard to make out.
And Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is definitely one of those.
Oh, yeah. And with Bernie's lyrics, even when you can hear the lyrics, it's hard to make out a lot of them.
Doesn't always make a lot of sense, on the surface anyway. But it's up to interpretation for the listener.
But you want to talk about a front-loaded album. Funeral for a Friend, Love Lies Bleeding, Candle in the Wind, Benny and the Jets, and then Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Bam, 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 bam. And then before the first record plays out, you get Gray Seal. And this is, again, the re-recording of his 1970 B-side. What a really, really cool song. Again, inscrutable lyric, but an interesting lyric. It's evocative. It's fascinating. But,
and just the piano in the song is just so cool.
Yeah, this has a kind of complex chord changes and a bit of a prog feel with some tempo changes. And the jam at the end of this is, again, his band is just lights out. Lights out. So great.
Yeah.
Jamaica Jerk Off. Now, here's a polarizing song. I think the title, more than anything else, probably puts people off. But I think it's a cool track. It's a rhythmic exercise. And I think there's a reason behind the off-putting title and the off-putting lyric is because they originally intended on recording this album in Jamaica. They actually flew to Jamaica and had this horrible experience in Jamaica.
Yep.
And they barely got out of the country alive. So I think they didn't have the best feelings about Jamaica and the whole experience, but they show they can certainly pull off Caribbean rhythms. And it's also early use of a drum machine.
Oh, yeah, true.
Yeah.
It just feels kind of just like a throwaway song to me. It doesn't really have much behind it.
It's just light. It's light, goofy fun. And again, I need to listen a few more times, but I kind of got the feeling listening to it that, it starts with a drum machine and then they kind of bring a reggae rhythm, reggae beat behind it. And it kind of transitions into almost a more of a ska beat at some point. So it's kind of it's shifting. It's like different Caribbean rhythms. Side 2, I definitely need to listen to more. Sweet Painted Lady is a cool track that starts it off. There's a run of songs.
That's a beautiful song.
Yeah, there's a run of Bernie lyrics on here that people find off-putting. They're not like real flattering about women. So Sweet Painted Lady is about prostitutes, dirty little girl.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a a nasty Stonesy type rock song. All the Girls Love Alice is a cool rocker, though. That's
I love that song.
Yeah, that's a really good one.
And that's a song I do recognize from radio play too. I like that one a lot. It starts out just kind of like a typical rocker, but it has really cool changes. The vibe changes. It gets quiet. And it has like a really groovy guitar and synths in the chorus. And yeah, that's actually one of my favorite songs on the album.
Yeah. And then you got Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, which, again, I was kind of a little surprised to learn that was the first single released off this album. I guess I always assumed that Goodbye Yellow Brick Road was the first single released off this.
It's actually a song that I've never really cared for much.
No, I've never had a lot of love for it. I don't dislike it, but it doesn't do it for me. I mean, it's in concert, it's their hardest rockin' song, and they played it a lot. I mean, that was like one of those songs they almost had to play. And again, Davy Johnston, this folky, and they're like, why do you want this folky in your band? Yeah, he can rock the hell out of the guitar. No question. Harmony, the last track. It was going to be the fourth single, but again, they're having so much success and longevity that they're already, Caribou's coming out soon. They've already had 3 hit singles off this album. They never got around to releasing Harmony as a single. Would have been a big hit had they done it. Beautiful song. One
of their best ballads, I think.
Yeah, certainly.
And actually, they also recorded the Step Into Christmas came out at this time, too.
Great song. Great song.
Yeah.
One of the great pop Christmas songs. I mean, Elton could do little wrong at this point. And this is where I first learned about their songwriting methods, the classic albums about Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Really should watch it. It's very entertaining because, Elton is so charming and funny. Bernie is just this wry wit. It's always love listening to him talk.
Yeah.
Gus Dudgeon is this rapier wit, just dry, cutting humor. Sadly, he's gone now. But this is where I learned about not only how Elton and Bernie worked together, but how crazily productive they were. Both of them. I mean, Elton would get these lyrics and just in minutes crank out these incredible melodic songs, these often very complex chord changes and harmonies, and incredibly fast writers, both of them. And they both said, if it takes me more than an hour, I'm just going to put it aside and forget about it. It's not worth pursuing,
Yeah, but all the years that Elton spent working as a session musician and bluesology and working behind all these amazing soul and R&B groups and listening and studying music.
Yeah.
And really, that's where this comes from. He has such a knowledge, such a broad knowledge, and it really does flows naturally from him because he put in so much time and so much work before he became famous, and he listened to a lot of music.
Yes. Major record collector from a young age.
Yeah.
And the work ethic is incredible. For a guy who wasn't much of a student, says he didn't really put the work in the academy, never really had a proper job, the work ethic is astounding. I mean, because they're cranking out all this music and they're constantly touring throughout this whole period. They're either in the studio or they're touring all the time. There's like no time off. And it would eventually burn him out. as we'll come to see here a few albums down the road. But they were just on top of the world at this point. Could do nothing wrong.
Yeah, could do no wrong.
Yeah. And then comes Caribou, which was definitely a step back, but I don't think it's nearly as bad an album as it's painted out to be. And the guy who painted it out to be worse than anybody else was actually Gus Dudgeon, the producer. I got to get the quote here to get this right because it is pretty biting. I can't find it here, but basically Gus Dudgeon just absolutely buried this record, and himself as well. He said it was just poorly written songs, lukewarm performance in the studio, bad production, horrible album cover.
Even the album cover.
The album cover is atrocious. It's it's horrid. It's amazing to think that this actually passed through people's, got some stamps of approval and got released. Because the albums were just beautiful. I mean, everything about his records, the cover art.
And look at the cover of Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. I mean, that's a piece of art. Well, he says it's a piece of crap. The sound is the worst. The songs are nowhere. The sleeve came out wrong. The lyrics weren't that good. The singing wasn't all there. The playing wasn't great. And the production is just plain lousy.
Yes, that pretty much covers the waterfront. So after you read that, and I read that before I ever listened to the album, you can't help but thinking it's better than it's painted out to be. And there's definitely some worthy tracks on here. Now, the singles, The Bitch Is Back, definitely not one of my favorite Elton songs.
No.
By a long shot. But Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me is, God, it's ballad heaven. I mean, it is so wonderful. And to think that Elton John thought it was easy listening crap and said, just send this piece of junk to Engelbert Humperdinck to record. Thankfully, somebody turned him around on that and got this released as a single because it's one of his great vocal performances, great, huge production, dramatic ballad, and it hits all the right notes. It is one of his greatest.
Yeah, definitely my favorite ballad of his and just vocal tour de force. And, one of those songs that people sing just to prove that they can sing, like on American Idol or, when somebody picks that song to sing, that they better have some really good pipes or else this is not going to work.
So it was a big hit for him. Didn't hit number one, but would hit number one later on in a duet with George Michael in 1991. The rest of the album, there's some interesting tracks on here and things I would revisit. Pinky, I like. Dixie Lily, I like. Solar Prestige Gamon. Now, this is one that turns a lot of people off. It's just this weird, just kind of novelty song. But listening to that, I thought, when did Caribou come out? 1974, Band on the Run. This would fit right into a Paul McCartney album for the same era. Nobody would bat an eye. Right. Same kind of stuff he was doing.
When you said that, I was like, yeah, actually, I think Pinky, Grimsby, You're So Static, like there's other songs on this album that could have been on a Paul McCartney album. They would have been on a mediocre, maybe Paul McCartney album, but not the best tracks on the album, but they would have fit on there. Yeah, I think this whole album, there's nothing great except Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me.
Yeah.
It's not terrible. There is one song, I've seen The Saucers, which is very silly and goofy.
Yeah, that's again,
alien abduction or something.
bad sequencing that leads off side 2 of the album. It's just that should have been buried deep on side 2. Stinker, I wouldn't say it is a stinker, but it's not a great song. But and then Ticking. You want to talk about darkness in Bernie? This might be the darkest song he ever wrote. This is, again, big Elton John fans. This is one of those deep cuts that a lot of people dig, and I like it a lot. Actually.
Yeah. I think it's kind of polarizing. I think it's been said to be like one of his best deep cuts on any album.
Yeah.
And then there's kind of that maybe over the top and like too much, but it's interesting.
It's about somebody who loses the plot and guns down 14 people in a bar.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's based on a true story, but certainly dark subject matter.
Pretty heavy stuff.
Bernie Taupin was not afraid to tackle dark subject matter, as we've seen time after time after time. I love the extra tracks, too, on the Rocket remaster, the 95 remaster. You got his version of Pinball Wizard, which I think is cool. Six City is a really cool B-side. I like that a lot. Cold Highway is okay. Again, Step Into Christmas ends up on this. So Caribou was seen as a rush job, and it was. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and touring, and then they had a big tour in Japan. They had to squeeze time in to record. The title comes from the studio. They're recording in the Caribou studio in Colorado at this point, but not as bad as it's painted out to me, I think. The next album that comes out is, again, one that I'm not nearly in an authoritative position to discuss much because I've only really listened to it once. But for Elton connoisseurs, it's a lot of people's favorite of theirs. And part of the reason is it's autobiographical. It's Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. And it's a concept album about the early days of Elton and Bernie as struggling songwriters in London before they broke big.
And it was the first album to be certified gold before it's released and reach number one in the first week of its release on the US Billboard charts.
Yep.
This is one of those sneaky ones to me. I know that it is considered like a 5-star album, and I love the song Captain Fantastic. It's my favorite song on the album. This is the album that's growing on me the most, along with Yellow Brick Road, I think. It is not an easy one, though. It's not immediate.
No.
And it isn't just a 1 or a 2 or a 3 listen.
Yeah.
It's like a several listen.
And I could tell that from first listening to it. Like, okay, I don't have the time to spend to really get to appreciate this album because I know it's going to take a few listens to do that. But I could tell it's a quality album, and it's one where you're really going to have to listen closely and hear the lyrics because it's telling their story. So to really appreciate that album, you need to live with it for a while. So that's why I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it is a favorite of a lot of Elton fans.
And it's the last album that has the lineup with Davy Johnstone, Dee Murray, and Nigel Olsson, too. And
Sadly.
Really, the guitar on this album really elevates the songs. It's really cool. Some of the songs on this album sound more like they could be on Yellow Brick Road. And actually, there's also some songs that sort of have a Beach Boys vocals feel to them. Like a 70s, the post-Pet Sounds Beach Boys.
I definitely picked up on as he's getting into the mid-70s, I'm hearing a little more of a Brian Wilson influence coming into his music, along with the other things. Yeah.
Yeah. And particularly it comes in a lot with the backup vocals.
Yeah.
Someone Saved My Life Tonight. That was the hit from this album.
So that, I listened to that record yesterday, and I made sure to just kind of stop and make sure I just completely focused on that song, because that's one that Elton says may be my best song, best performance. And it's a poignant song because it's about a poignant moment in his life.
It's about his marriage. Yeah.
Right. I've heard that song plenty of times over the years, but really sitting down and focusing on it, you could see where he's coming from. It's a wonderful performance, a wonderful vocal, beautiful song, and certainly up there with the greats in his canon, no question.
Yeah, and a very personal song for him. Yeah. And I mean, as this whole album is. And it's 6 minutes and 45 seconds long. And he refused to let them shorten it. It's one of his longest singles. I think it is the longest single that he put out. And it reached number 4 on the US charts. There's a couple songs, the last 2 songs, very McCartney-esque. The last song, Curtains, super Beatle-esque in like Sgt. Pepper's Magical Mystery Tour sort of way. And actually, it's interesting because those 2 songs, the last 2 songs on the album, with the bonus tracks, the first bonus track is Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
And he does a really good version of that, too.
He does. Yeah. It's one of the coolest Beatle covers, I think. And then he does a cover of a John Lennon composition, One Day at a Time. And then the other bonus track is Philadelphia Freedom, which is the only song that Elton ever commissioned Bernie to write.
And Bernie's like, Elton, I can't write a song about tennis.
Yes.
I'm not writing a song about tennis. That's not a good Bernie accent. He's up from up north. But I'm trying to decide whether I want to gush about that song now or wait to the end.
It's up to you.
I absolutely love that song. If Benny and the Jets is my favorite Elton John song, Philadelphia Freedom's my second favorite. So I like the goofy pop big hit Elton John song. So Philadelphia Freedom, it's kind of it's corny, but it's just so fun. It's just so fun and uplifting and fun to sing along to. It's a nod to the
Philadelphia sound.
The sound of Philadelphia, Tom Bell and Kenny Gamble and Huff, and so they wanted to get that vibe. And that's kind of how Elton, I think, greased the wheels for Bernie. It's like, it doesn't have to be just about tennis. Let's get some nods to Philly soul in there and patriotism, freedom, Philadelphia Freedom. That was the name of the Billie Jean King's tennis team, was the Philadelphia Freedoms. So in the 70s, they came up with this team tennis concept, and they wanted to start a league of tennis teams. Tennis is an individual sport. They wanted to make it into a team sport. It didn't really work so hot. It went around for a few years. But, it had its moment in the sun in the mid-'70s. And Elton, big sports fan that he was, big Billie Jean King fan for many reasons and worthy reasons. She's an incredible, incredible person, not just an incredible athlete, one of the great Americans, really. Everything she's done. So he loved Billie Jean King, and he said, Billie, I promise you, I'm going to write you a song. I'm going to write a song for you. He said, so he pitches it to Bernie, and Bernie's, I'm not writing about tennis.
No.
So there's no tennis references in the song. But
no, not at all.
What a fun, it's the goofiest lyrics, just goofy as all hell. But it is such a fun song. It is so catchy. And the strings, da, da, da. The strings, of course, were an essential element of Philadelphia soul. The whole idea behind the Philly soul sound was classing it up, making it a classier production. So strings and horns and classical concepts being interpolated into black music. God, I so love this song.
I've never been like a huge fan of this song, but I really have never listened to it that closely.
God.
But now I think it's great. I mean, I spent some more time like really listening to it, and I always kind of thought it was a little goofy or something.
It is goofy. It is.
But
in a great
that doesn't take away from the song. Yeah, in a great way. And
it's great because it's goofy.
The bass is really cool. The backup vocals. I mean, it came out right before the bicentennial. It was 1975. It works on a couple different levels. It's actually, I really like it a lot.
And it's Elton at the peak of his vocal powers, too.
Yes.
I mean, the way that he could slip from normal voice to falsetto and back so easily. And just the number of textures that he had in his, it's phenomenal singer. The lyrics are so silly. One of the funnest songs of the 70s and one of my favorite songs of the 70s. And again, we've talked about, as we've gone along in the playlist, I've said, there's going to be a time where we might go back and make an edit and say, okay, I'm going to take this song off, put this on. Philadelphia Freedom is one of those songs. It might unseat something from 75 for me. I don't know.
Yeah, I could see that. Was it a number one for him?
Number one.
Okay.
Yes, it was. Yeah. Number one.
Should be.
So should we go on to Rock of the Westies?
What else would we do?
So drugs have entered the picture at this point, clearly.
Yes.
Within the first 30 seconds of this album, first thing that comes to my mind is the cocaine has definitely arrived. The cocaine has definitely arrived. Now, you mentioned Three Dog Night earlier. Danny Hutton claims to be the one who introduced Elton John to cocaine. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you so much, Danny. Great job.
Yeah, really.
I'm sure you're so proud of yourself. What a horrible drug. So this album starts off with Yell Help Wednesday Night Ugly. And it is ugly. It's an ugly song. It's just, God, what a horrible way to open an album. Easily the worst opening track on any of his albums to this point.
With LaBelle singing backup. Yeah.
Now, Elton John's downfall from chart domination, you can point at any number of things. It's probably the combination of all of the above. So the drugs have come in. He's hopelessly addicted to cocaine at this point, would be for a number of years. He's parted ways with his great Elton John band. So no more D. Murray on bass, who's just a phenomenal bass player. Nigel Olsson, with his incredible feel on the drums, is now gone. He parts ways with Gus Dudgeon eventually. Paul Buckmaster's no longer doing string arrangements. So all these crucial elements to his music are no longer there. At a certain point...
And the drugs are really taking a toll on his vocals.
Yeah. There's a lot of people who want to claim that, his coming out was a factor in his commercial decline as well. Maybe a little bit, but I don't think that's a significant... I mean,
I don't think it's significant.
It's just the timing. The timing of the announcement happened to be at a time when the stuff he's putting out just isn't as good. And he's burned out. He's exhausted. He's addicted to drugs. And he's broken up his band. So there's all these changes happening simultaneously.
And before this album came out, he put together this big concert with Rufus, with Shaka Khan, Joe Walsh. The Beach Boys were actually on the bill too. And he plays the entirety of Captain Fantastic. The Beach Boys play before him. And this is when Endless Summer, their collection, was riding in the charts again. And so all of their old hits were really huge. Yeah,
perfect timing for them, capitalizing on the wave of nostalgia that's gripping the United States when they put out that collection. Yeah.
And then Elton comes out headlining and plays the whole album all the way through. And people are just like not pleased. And he talks about it in his book. He had announced at the beginning that we're going to play the whole album all the way through. So he's like, so I couldn't go back on it now, and turned out to be quite a fiasco for him. And I think that it really shook his confidence too.
So this whole album, there's some hot garbage on here, but the whole album isn't hot garbage. There's a lot of really cool stuff on here, actually.
Yeah, I think so too.
It starts horrible. I don't understand. How do you pick that track to start this album? It's god awful. Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future. That's an interesting song. I like that.
I like it. It's funky.
There were 3 hit singles. The big hit was Island Girl, which is easily, I think, the worst of his hit songs.
Of his number one hits.
His number ones.
Yeah.
Just
weird.
Cringy lyrics on. I mean, it's
yes.
Again, if you're a woman especially, you don't want to look too closely at Bernie's lyrics on a lot of these songs.
I kind of like the slide guitar.
Yeah.
It's got a disco-y synth behind it too. It's a weird song. It really is.
Kind of a cool guitar riff and the little strummy part. The way the song opens. Yeah. But never have liked it. Never have liked that song. Grow some funkier own. That was a single too. You never hear that on the radio for good reason.
No.
But another song you never hear on the radio, which I think is quite a good song, is I Feel Like a Bullet in the Gun of Robert Ford, which is a ballad.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of surprised that never endured. I think it's quite good, actually. Then the most interesting track of this album for me, Street Kids, it's a real different sound for Elton. But he's listening to everything, folks. Everything. And he dug the Southern rock sounds that were popular in the United States at that time. So he's kind of channeling. I hear that song and I hear a combination of Lynyrd Skynyrd and Bad Company. But it's a really cool rocker.
I think the guitar riff sounds like Allman Brothers, Midnight Rider. It sounds just like that.
It does. Yeah, it does.
Yes.
He definitely did a lot of songs in the Stones vein, but I definitely hear Midnight Rider in Street Kids.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes.
I think it's really cool.
I think it's cool. I think this album is definitely his most rockin' album.
No question. Yeah. And I think they knew that. I think that's kind of what he was going for. And I think that's kind of why he broke up the band. He wanted to bring in a little more of a harder rock influence. So he brings back Roger Pope on the drums, who drummed on a lot of early albums with the session musicians. And then Caleb Quay on guitar, who played on a lot of those early albums, is now back in the band too. He kept Davy Johnstone. Davy had proved his hard rock metal.
Yeah.
But I think he felt like Nigel Olsson was just not a suitable drummer for the sound he was going for. Nigel's got more of a funky feel, more of a light touch, and he wanted more of a harder backbeat. So that's why he brought Roger Pope back in. And then Kenny Passarelli, who was in Joe Walsh's group Barnstorm. Now the bassist. And then James Newton Howard, who would go on to fame as a soundtrack composer, is brought in as an extra keyboardist on electronic. Also, a guy we haven't mentioned, who's really a key part of the band sound, is the percussionist, Ray Cooper.
And he becomes very important later, touring with Elton.
Yeah. So this is part of the decline, this album, but again, there's cool stuff on here. But the real revelatory experience listening to the next record, because...
there's one more thing that came out at the same time, too, and it was his first number one single in the UK, and that's Don't Go Breaking My Heart.
Oh, yeah.
With Kiki D.
I don't love it. I don't hate it.
I was surprised to hear that this was his first number one single in the UK, after all the hits he's had in the US.
He broke in America really before he broke in the UK. And they actually talk about it at the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road documentary. It's like, we felt like a lot of people in the UK maybe perceived us as American artists because we really didn't have that notoriety in the UK before we hit it in the US. And there was a lot of American influence in their sound early on. So, they sold a lot of records in the UK. They just never had a big number one until that duet with Kiki D. Part of his burnout commercially, not only is he working himself to death touring and recording, but he's also running a record label. So he started Rocket Records. He didn't put his own music on a record, but he wanted a label where he could scout bands and develop talent. And that's where Kiki D came in. Interesting note, the first band signed to Rocket Records was called Long Dancer. They did not have a hit, but one of their members would go on to have massive hits throughout the 80s. Dave Stewart of Eurythmics.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So while Elton is having all these big hits in 75, he had multiple number one hits. Neil Sedaka had his big comeback on Rocket Records. Neil Sedaka, of course, an influence on Elton, and an artist I think who is underappreciated, incredibly gifted musician, great piano player. I mean, classical chops on piano, amazing vocalist, and a great songwriter from the Brill Building days. And he had his comeback under Elton's purview on Rocket Records.
Laughter in the Rain.
Laughter in the Rain, great song. Bad Blood.
Love that song.
Bad Blood was a #1 hit. And then I think Philadelphia Freedom came right on the heels of that, or maybe Island Girl. I think he had back-to-back hits with Neil on Rocket Records, which he sang on, by the way. I think he even gets credit on the single. You'll see Neil Sedaka featuring Elton John on the Bad Blood single. That was a #1 hit. And then Elton John supplanted that with one of his own songs on the chart. So he's dominating the pop charts at this point. And on top of all that, he's also running a football club in England, which he was very serious about, very passionate about.
In fact, he says it basically saved his life.
Yeah.
Because it gave him something to focus on that wasn't music. And it was just at his decline in the music world when he was really focusing on Watford FC.
And they were a nothing club.
Yep.
So they do things differently in English football. You know, it's not like American sports where the leagues stay the same. They have what's called
how bad the teams are.
In England, in the professional football, soccer leagues in England, they have promotion and relegation. So they have levels, divisions. So you have first division, second division, third division, fourth division. So if you're a losing club, if you're a perennial loser, you go into that fourth division. And you have to prove yourself over a number of years to earn your way up to that first division by winning more games, beating teams in divisions ahead of you. And then you could play for the ultimate prize, but not until you get to that first division. So Watford was one of those bottom of the barrel clubs. And actually under his leadership, worked its way up from the fourth to the first division. So he was putting
5 years.
Yeah. So he was putting a lot of energy and effort and passion into that as much as he was his music. So, I mean, it can't help but kind of dilute what he's doing in the musical realm at that point. I mean, one man could only do so much, right?
Yeah.
You could see why he's sniffing coke at this point. So
just to keep up with his life.
I know.
Yeah.
Just when do you sleep? When do you sleep? So, yeah, Rock of the Westies, definitely not as good as his previous stuff. And then Blue Moves, Rock of the West, it was still a hit album, still at a big number. Island Girl was a huge hit. I mean, it was a #1 for multiple weeks.
You know, it's funny because that's one you don't really hear. You don't hear that song on the radio anymore. You don't hear it, just kind of
because it's not very
faded
good.
Away. It's not that good. Yeah, it's hard to believe it was a #1 hit.
I know. But again, he was so popular at this point. Anything he touched, and we didn't really talk more about it. I mean, his relationship with John Lennon. You know, they had a little bet.
Yeah. And that was in 74?
Yeah. So the bet was what? That Elton could go to #1 with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that John Lennon would go on.
No, it was Whatever Gets You Through the Night that they recorded on John's album.
Oh, okay.
And he had yet to have a #1 solo, whereas all the other Beatles had at that point. And so Elton said, if this song goes to #1, you have to come out and perform it with me. And it went to #1. So John did perform with him, and that was actually the last performance that John ever did, the last live performance.
Thankfully, it was preserved on record and video. That had to rankle John Lennon, right? God, Ringo had 2 #1s, right? Didn't he have 2? Photograph, and then was his cover You're 16 #1 too?
I don't know if that was a #1.
It was a huge hit. It was a big hit.
But it was still a big hit, yeah. I mean, he had Imagine, Instant Karma. I mean, he had big songs.
Oh, yeah, but he never had #1.
Yeah.
But anyway, so he struck a deal with Elton, and Elton's obviously very confident at this point. So
he's like, trust me, it's going to go to #1. I'm on it. It's going to go to #1.
He is king. In 74 and 75, Elton John is King Midas incarnate. Everything he touches turns to gold. But he's definitely on the decline now. But before the 70s are out, he releases this record, Blue Moves. No big hit singles on it. Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word was the hit. It was top 10, I think. Not a huge hit.
One of the most depressing songs to be a hit single, really.
Yeah. Nice vocal performance, though. Now, I've read about this a lot before I ever listened to it. And there's a small cult out there that really love this album. But for the most part, it's seen as the beginning of his commercial decline and the decline of quality in his music. Well, I listened to it for the first time, and it's a different sounding record for sure. It just doesn't have the same vibrancy as a lot of his earlier music does. It's just kind of a more sedate vibe to it, a bit of a downcast vibe. And it was inspired by breakups. Both Elton and Bernie had relationship breakups around this time. And Blue Moves. I mean, that's a nod to Blue, feeling blue, clearly.
Yeah.
I listened to the first disc of the two albums. I really, really liked it a lot.
It's a really interesting album, and it is really different. In fact, the way it starts out, I actually had to do like a double check to make sure this was actually Elton John.
Yeah.
It is so different from anything else. And the first song, it almost has like an easy listening feel mixed with like Andrew Lloyd Webber. It's a very odd combination of like show tunes, and then there's some songs that are prog-ish. It's definitely his most prog album. And then there's some songs that sound like they should be on a Ken Russell soundtrack. They're just so bombastic and weird. The first time I listened to this, I listened to it all the way through. It's a double album. It's very long. And I just thought, this is just so bizarre. And it's so unlike anything else he had done. And I really didn't feel like that I was going to want to listen to it anymore. It didn't even matter that it's a double album. Nothing would have been worse or better making it a single album. It's either you like this or you don't. And then I actually went back and listened to it a couple more times, and I listened to it again today. And all of a sudden I was like, what was I thinking? This is really cool.
Yeah.
I really like this album. My opinion totally just did a 180 on it. I think he's got a lot of different people working with him. He's got the Brecker brothers on horns. Graham Nash is doing backup vocals. Bruce Johnson from the Beach Boys. And there are quite a few songs on this album that have a 70s Beach Boys feel. And Tony Tennille sings on this album.
And if you've never listened to the 70s Beach Boys stuff, there's a lot of absolute gold to be found.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That a lot of people are not familiar with.
Right.
In fact, there's a song on this album that it was written like 3 years before Chameleon that he wanted the Beach Boys to record, and they turned him down, which is weird because this song is much better than anything the Beach Boys were doing at that time.
When I say 70s Beach Boys, I'm veering toward the beginning of the 70s, not
early 70s.
Not 76 when Blue Moves came out.
No. There's a lot of different styles on this album. There's a song that kind of has like a Dr. John, that New Orleans piano feel, Cage the Songbird, really pretty singer-songwriter style. Crazy Water sounds like ELO, the bombastic kind of prog synth sound. There's one song, Shoulder Holster, that has the band feel. He's really all over the place, kind of just like the music that he really likes, like his personal...
It's all over the place, but it still has a very cohesive sound.
Yeah, it works together.
Yeah. This was the last hurrah with Gus Dudgeon at the desk as producer, and also the last hurrah with Bernie Taupin writing the lyrics, at least for a while. Or last hurrah of the 70s. They would part ways. This is the point where things really drop off dramatically after those two relationships come to an end. Again, I've just only started listening. I've only listened to the first disc once. And I got a little Fleetwood Mac vibe off of it, too.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
He had a couple singles, or the last song is this rollicking, like, bite your lip, get up and dance, which just is like a rave up kind of,
And that was a single release.
That was a single. Yeah. It was in the top 40. And then he did have the hit with Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word. Crazy Water was also released as a single and was in the top 40. But there's songs that you never heard again. They just fell off the radar. For how long it is as a double album, I think it works all the way through. And it is worthy of revisiting. Of all the albums in his catalog, I would say this and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road were the most surprising to me, as far as ones that I wanted to go back and listen to.
So this is also the first record that he released after the revelation, I think, in Rolling Stone, that he was bisexual. And again, a lot of people will point to that and say, well, that causes commercial decline. Well, the songs he's putting out just are not at the same level, certainly, of what had come previously. It's more of an artistic statement here. It's a double album. Nothing really screams single on this album.
No.
And we mentioned all the other factors that are starting to feed into the slowing of his productivity and his greatness. That's just one minor factor, I think. Things really drop off the cliff after this, though, after he parts ways with Gus and Bernie. And this is where I get off the Elton train. I couldn't tell you anything about his last two albums of the 70s other than they're supposed to be horrible. Single Man.
I listened to them. The biggest note I made for Single Man was no Bernie, no bueno.
I've heard enough of his work with Gary Osborne. I mean, not good.
And actually, this is the first album where he sings in the lower register. Yeah. So his vocals have changed a lot too. And There's one song that was a bonus track on this album. It's called Ego. And that actually was written with lyrics were written by Bernie. And it's a good song. It's cool. And that was going to be like the next direction they were going. But then he and Bernie decided to go their separate ways. And Victim of Love, there is a clip in the movie Rocket Man where they show him in the studio recording the song Victim of Love. And it's just the most awful going into the 80s production. And
this is Elton jumping on the disco train years too late. And
way too late.
And not very convincingly.
At the decline of disco.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Didn't write any songs on the album. Didn't play piano on the album. Only offers his vocals and that's it.
Pointless.
But in the movie, they show him kind of just be like, I don't even care. They're like, do you want to listen to the playback? He's like, no. It's kind of really just tells you right there the whole story of that.
I think what that tells me is where his head is at. He's way more focused on Watford football than music at this point.
And Coke.
Yeah, exactly. But it's kind of odd.
And guess who sings backup on this album?
Who?
Michael McDonald.
Oh, of course. Michael McDonald didn't sleep in 1979 and 80, did he? I find it a bit odd, don't you, that Elton never messed around with disco before that?
Philadelphia Freedom seems about the most disco-y thing he did before that.
Doesn't really seem like disco to me. I mean, it's
no, you're right.
It's Philly soul.
It's Philly soul.
Yeah.
I don't know. That is kind of surprising because he was a big fan of Studio 54, right, and he was like all into disco. He loved disco, which would make perfect sense. So yeah, that is kind of odd.
As flamboyant as person he was at this point, I mean, it's odd to me that it would take so long for him to come around to that. But you mentioned the voice changing. I remember when Little Genie came out, his first album in the 80s. I remember hearing that. So this is the first time that Elton John had a new song out that me, as a listener of contemporary hit radio, was picking up on as a current hit. And I remember thinking, wow, is that the same guy? He's so low. His voice is so low. Oh, Little Genie.
It's much different.
But love the song. I liked it at the time. I still like it. But yeah, totally different sound.
Yeah, and then he really just kind of lost the ability to be able to sing in those higher registers. And
yeah, happens to all of us. I'm surprised.
And abusing his body as he did too.
That's right.
You know. Before
we sign off with our Elton John episodes, we got to pick our favorites, of course. We've already established both of our favorite albums, Tumbleweed Connection. I think that goes without saying. What are the contenders for your favorite Elton song, Sheryl?
I really still have to stick with two of the most popular Elton songs.
Me too.
I know you said Rocket Man isn't one of your favorite songs, but it is one of mine.
No. Rocket Man is his greatest single, I believe, and it's one of my favorite songs.
Maybe you said it wasn't your number one favorite song.
It might be number
okay.
Might be number 3.
Okay, so Rocket Man. I didn't realize until I went back and listened to it on the album and just listened to it more how much I really, really love Goodbye Yellow Brick Road.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, also one of his most popular songs.
How many chord changes in that song?
Oh, God, I know. It's like every chord is different.
It's just so brilliant.
Madman Across the Water. I think that's one of the best songs of the 70s. And I think that's I feel like that might be my favorite song of his, actually. It has the combination, what Tumbleweed Connection has, that Americana, the band kind of feel, but it also has the drama behind it.
That's probably the most dramatic song in his canon. The string arrangements on that are just out of this world.
Yep, it's powerful. Oh, I really love Burn Down the Mission and Mona Lisa's and Mad Hatters. He has so many great, Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me.
Yeah.
That's one that I forget about. And that is also one of the best songs in the 70s. And dramatic, but in a different way, not with the strings, but with the vocal performance. Yeah. You know, just such an amazing vocal performance.
The horns on that. Oh, God. The finale, the horns. Oh, just incredible. So much great music. But I have to
What about you?
I got to stick to my childhood faves, the ones that I've loved for the longest. And for me, it's Benny and the Jets and Philadelphia Freedom. Those are the two Elton songs that were just near misses as far as making the playlist for me for 74 and 75.
Yeah, I'm surprised Philadelphia Freedom didn't make it for you or Mike, because I know he loves that song.
Oh, God. That song it just brings a smile to my face, and I cannot help but sing along to it whenever I hear it and give it the full on singing along too.
Yeah.
As far as deep cuts are concerned, there's so many good ones. I mean, like I said, there's just gems on every album, but
yeah,
the ones that I've newly discovered, Mellow, from Honky Chateau. Just love it. Love it. And Gray Seal, both versions of Gray Seal I like a lot. And I think I'm going to lean toward the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road version just because it's an incredible band performance on that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, everything on Tumbleweed Connection could be considered a deep cut because there weren't any singles on it. But My Father's Gun, I've read a lot of other people's opinions about Elton John, and a lot of people say, well, the outro just goes on too long on that. It can't go on long enough for me. I mean, that song could go on forever as far as I'm concerned. That chorus is just so beautiful. And then, Close Inside and on to Where To Now, Saint. There's so many great songs. I love Country Comforts too.
Oh,
I really love that. And Amarina.
Come Down in Time.
Come Down in Time is so beautiful.
Yes. Love Amarina.
Great record. But Mellow is the new discovery that I'm excited about. Because I'd never heard Honky Chateau until just recently. I got to say this. Doing this podcast with you it's like I don't care if anybody else ever hears it. I mean, it just, what this is doing for me as far as my appreciation of music and opening new doors and opening doors that had closed that shouldn't have. One of the greatest things I think about doing this podcast with you is revisiting the songs of my youth, my very young childhood. Songs and artists that I loved as a young kid that I've always liked, never stopped loving. But as an older person, once I got to be in my teens and 20s and was starting to buy music and buy albums specifically, for whatever reason, didn't go back and buy the albums of the artists that I loved from hearing the singles as a kid in the 70s. And this is a perfect example. Elton John, all those great hits from the 70s that I loved as a kid, but the only album I ever really listened to more than a few times was Tumbleweed Connection until recently.
Which was the one album that didn't have singles.
Yes.
That you knew.
Why is that? Yeah. It's not like I never stopped liking those songs,
Right. And that's kind of what I was saying about feeling like Elton John sort of fits into two categories in my mind. There's the hit maker, and then there's the album artist. And they're two very different artists to me. And I feel the same way about doing the podcast. And we did another show like this with Steely Dan. And both Steely Dan and Elton John, I've listened to their albums, more than just one or two albums. I've listened to others, but I really hadn't delved deeply into their catalogs. And it kind of makes me feel like, boy, if I went back and did this with a lot of bands that I know the hits, I know the songs that everybody knows, and I maybe know a few albums, but really going in and digging deep into their catalogs like that, I'm sure that I would discover that there's so much more that I really did not know about these artists that are big, huge, artists that we already feel like we know a lot about.
Right. But three artists in particular, since we've started this podcast: Elton, Electric Light Orchestra. I had never bought one of their albums. I mean, what is wrong with me? And the Bee Gees.
Right. So that was a revelation. The Bee Gees was just a huge, mind-blowing revelation.
Yeah. So now, I'm on this quest. Who
else
with
is
the Bee
out
Gees.
there that we really need to dig deep in their catalogs?
So Elton, you barely missed for me on two of those. Rocket Man, a little too early. 72, we only had the one song, obviously. Benny and the Jets, Philadelphia Freedom, right there fighting to get onto that playlist. Maybe I'll go back and revisit and change my mind.
And we couldn't pick Tumbleweed Connection as the album either.
No.
So 70, 71, yeah.
So Elton's 70s didn't end on a great note, but he would have his comeback by 83 with the Too Low for Zero album and have more great hits in the 80s and continue to be a valid artist for years to come, and still with us, thankfully. And I believe he's on his farewell tour now, as a matter of fact, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
So only too happy to turn over a special show to Elton John. It's been great fun leading up to this show to dive into the catalog. And unfortunately, I got hung up on those early 70s albums and I didn't get too far into it. But it's been a fun listening experience, and it will be for the rest of my life.
Yep, me too. I hope people will go back and revisit or visit Blue Moves and Captain Fantastic. once again, not an album that had like a lot of hits. I believe people will be more familiar with that than Blue Moves as an album, but I'm sure there's probably a lot of people out there that really haven't given it a lot of time, and it's worthy.
So with that, we wrap up the decade of the 70s. We forge ahead into the 1980s. In our next episode, we will start to tackle the year 1980. And I know our peers are like, finally.
Yeah.
Finally,
these Gen Xers.
Finally, they're going to start to talk about our music instead of our parents' music.
Yeah.
So that's coming up. Can't wait. And until next time, I'm Matt.
I'm Sheryl.
And this is Matt and Sheryl's Gen Excellent Playlist. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.